Today I try and remember my high school geography and build a river scene. Hi everyone, I'm Martin and welcome back to Donnington Castle Model Railway. Today it's all about starting the river scene. Now if you've watched my video on building the viaduct, you'll know exactly where the river scene is going to be because it's going to flow underneath that structure down on the bottom left hand corner of the layout. So it's a little bit of a strange area because it's kind of a little bit of a triangle between the heritage line, the main running lines, and then the southern line going over the viaduct. And the idea is to have a river flowing underneath. I'm not aware of anywhere in the real world that kind of looks anything like this. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to start from any photographs of the real world. I'll be really interested though when we get to the end, if anyone does suddenly recognize a place that looks similar to it. So one of the things I'm going to need to do is turn to a little bit of theory, try and remember a little bit of high school geography. But actually look into some books that might be able to give us a little bit of a helping hand on what the kind of the topography and the general kind of layout of the landscape is going to look like in an area like this. Now in the past I used to do some sailing. I used to actually sail class 40, which was a very confusing conversation sometimes when people thought that I was trying to sail around in a massive 1950s diesel. But anyway, one of the things that I was very keen to understand when I was a sailor is how to tell what the water around you is actually telling you. And luckily there is a great book if you're interested in learning that. And it's this one right here. It's called How to Read Water by Tristan Gooley. Now Tristan is what you might call a natural navigator and kind of a landscape explorer. His books are full of absolutely fascinating information about how to interpret kind of signs in the landscape. And as modelers, a lot of those are really kind of vital to us because they can help us to add those little touches of realism to a layout that we might not be aware of just by kind of looking at other reference material or other layouts, things like that. If you do have access to a copy of Tristan's book, then the first few chapters are really actually quite relevant to modelers. So for example, if you have a farm track maybe on your layout and it kind of runs east-west, have you thought about which side of that track puddles are most likely to form, because they won't form equally on both sides? The answer to that is that they will most likely form on the southern side. And if you want to find out why, then go have a read of the book. But in my case, one of the chapters in there is about rivers, and I'm going to be using some of the information in there to help me figure out the way that a river should look in the landscape that I'm modelling it in. And what I'll do is I'll talk through some of that theory and kind of show you how I put that into practice as I go through the process. Now, I know building this river scene is going to take a long time, so I'm expecting that this video will be split into a couple of different parts. I'm most likely in this video going to get up to the point whereby I'm ready for all of the kind of the water to be added with resin and things like that. Mostly because I need to go do lots more research on any of that before I attempt that. With the landscaping bit I'm pretty comfortable with. So anyway, enough talking, let's get over to the layout. I'll show you how things look now and we'll see how we get on. So a little bit of prep for this area before we start landscaping. So I filled in that hole in the baseboard where the old support was. I then just put a piece of wood in there because there's then going to be blocks of insulation foam on top of it. So that's just giving that a nice solid base. And then I'm just building up what will be just a last tiny little bit of a track bed from the edge of the viaduct up to the fascia here. I did mention a long time ago, but there's a possibility that if the layout does get extended, then this southern main line will then continue on. But then otherwise, I'm not sure what the kind of the base of the river is going to be, how I'm going to do that. Obviously, if I'm using resin, I'm going to need a completely watertight seal. So I don't know how I'm going to do that at the moment, given that the backboards are still removable. Because I do still need access at the moment. There's obviously this gap down here, so I'm thinking about using a bit of caulk or something just to try and seal that one up. although I'm expecting there'll be a surface on top of it before we start adding resin. But that's kind of where we're at. Next job, I'll get the track piece fitted in here, and then start building some of the landscape up with some insulation foam, and then start sculpting that. And here we have the basics of the landscape in place with insulation foam. Let me just talk you through a few key things. Now, the thing to remember at this point is that the baseboard is the bottom of the river. So you need to kind of just adjust your kind of brain and kind of thinking when you look at that. It was kind of quite tough to kind of keep that in mind when I was building it, but I think I got there in the end. So let's start with the river. The channel you can see is not the entire river. That's our Thalweg. So that's our deepest part of our river and also our fastest flowing. Then we have our outer bank, and this probably doesn't come through very well on the camera at the moment, but our outer bank is more concave, and our Thalweg is closer to the outer bank than it is to the inner bank. Then the inner bank has a much shallower convex appearance to it, and then that will go through our bridge. We have a little bit of a rise in front of the pillar where the water goes either side. Then on this side, we've got some kind of, I guess, sheer drops. These are going to be cliffs. This is going to be more like the bedrock that this kind of part of the landscape is made out of. And the river's obviously not been able to kind of carve its way through there as well as it has the rest of the landscape. That's why that's kind of a very hard edge around there. A bit of a floodplain. So if our kind of river floods, it kind of flows onto that section there, and that's why that's kind of nice and flat. And then more of a kind of a V shape on this side, where the river is kind of carved through the landscape. And then perhaps this embankment here is kind of partly artificially made, needing to kind of raise the track level up to the same as the track on the other side. So with all that in place, the next job will be to go over that with plaster bandage. And when I do that, I'm going to kind of smooth that out as much as possible in the river, kind of try and fill as many of the holes as possible to try and get as kind of many sealed layers as possible there. So when it comes to pouring resin later, hopefully nothing should be leaking out anywhere. But hopefully that gives you a good sense of what the landscape's going to look like. There's kind of key things to bear in mind when we get to doing the river and the detail. The width of our river is really important, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the features that kind of rely on or kind of more, I guess, related to the width of a river when we get to that point. So I'll come back when everything is plaster bandaged, and hopefully you'll then kind of see how things are going. Our plaster bandage is now done. That's all white, but hopefully that comes across on camera what that's looking like. In the riverbed, I've smoothed it out a little bit just to try and get as kind of watertight a seal as possible when it comes to pouring resin. Obviously, this isn't the kind of the final surface it's going to be done on. A couple of things to point out. Here we're going to have a little culvert where effectively they're kind of taken an existing stream and kind of managed that underneath the railway. That will then kind of drop down here on a waterfall. As it's set in the summer, hopefully that won't be too difficult to do. I don't really fancy my first waterfall being a kind of a raging torrent of kind of winter time. So there's a little channel here that kind of takes that into the main river. In terms of the structure of the river, there are a couple of features that we need to be mindful of. So typically on a lowland river, we will find that in every length of river that's 5 times its width, there will be a series of features called a riffle, a glide, and a pool. And that kind of describes how the features of the river would change over that kind of length. So our river width here is kind of about going to be there, and 5 times its length is actually the length of this section in here. So in here, I'm going to be modelling, first of all, the bottom end of a riffle here. And now a riffle is where the water moves fast. So we're going to build this end up a little bit. The river's quite shallow, and kind of features of that are kind of rapids and things like that. Then there is a kind of a moderately, a kind of a section of moderate depth and moderate speed called a glide, and that leads down into a deeper section of river called a pool, where the water flows much more slowly. So you can imagine that's going to be in this kind of area here, and our glide kind of leading between the two. And then that feature set then starts over again. So we've got a bit of a glide, and then you'll just start to see the beginning of the next riffle underneath the viaduct. So we'll have kind of a little bit of kind of white water as if the that kind of rapid section is starting again under there. So that means we're going to need some sculptor mold just to kind of bring the landscape a little bit closer to its final kind of look and feel. So that's going to be the next job. As always, using homemade sculptor mold made from toilet tissue and plaster of Paris. So that'll be the next job. I'll come back when that's all in place, and you can see then what the kind of the contours and the landscapes look like. In doing this, I'll probably pop the culvert in here, because we'll obviously need to use sculptor mold around that to make sure that beds in. But I'll be back shortly. There's quite a lot of area to cover, so I've run out of homemade sculptor mold. Some people have asked how I make mine, so very, very quickly. Got some really cheap toilet rolls there, a bit of water, and I managed to sneak an old cheap hand blender out of the house. So I've already got some water in here, but we'll put some more in. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this stuff, rip it up, while I put a knife through that, and just kind of rip it up and drop it in there, and then get the old blender on that. So I'll do that, and then show you how that turns out. That's 3 toilet rolls, all ripped up and then soaked in water. I'm going to put a bit more water on the top of that. For the blender, it's actually better if there's more water. You can always drain it off at the end. So I'll add a bit more water and then get blending. And this is kind of the consistency you're looking for. This needs a little bit more work on it, but it's kind of like cottage cheese. You can hopefully see the difference here with the stuff on the left compared to the kind of the stuff on the right that I haven't touched yet. Certainly don't use your best blender on this, but I will come back when all that's done. So those 3 toilet rolls have got 3 litres of water in here now, and it's absorbed it all, so there's no kind of water running off at the moment. So you can see how kind of squishy, but also how fine this has gone. Depending on kind of, I guess the quality of your blender depends on how kind of fine you want to kind of get this. But for me, this is absolutely perfect. And it's the kind of stuff that I've been using on the layout. So next step should be to dry this out. So try and kind of drain off any runoff. But as I say, most of the water is actually absorbed into the paper now. So stick that in the sun in the garden or in an airing cupboard or something. When it's dried out, then you can keep that as long as you want. When it comes to using it, I've shown how I do that in the past. Just grab some of this dry, add some water to it, and add a bit of plaster of Paris. Mix it all up, and then you're good to go. Right, so that's all done. I can now finish applying that to the river scene. I've made quite a bit of progress in this area, so let me just get you up to date with that. So there is a little bit of sculptor mold still to do around the back of the viaduct, so I'm going to take the back scene off to do that. But otherwise, the plaster bandage has all been covered over. There was still a little bit of detailing of the riverbank to be done. It's probably really hard to see with it all being white. So that's something I need to do, but I might do that after I've put a base layer of paint down, just so I can kind of see where everything is. Sculptor mold is also used to kind of bed everything in. So at this stage, I've also had to do, or at least start the kind of the cliff face along here, which hasn't been all plain sailing. So I'll talk you through some of those challenges. But firstly, though, you can see the little culvert's gone in there now. And now that's going to kind of lead onto this rock, and then that's going to give us a nice drop down as a waterfall into that little pool below. So that should look pretty good. So with the rock, this is all cast from Woodland Scenics mold. It's actually only one mold. What I do is kind of cast different sections of the different rocks. And then also when some of them come out, when the plaster's gone hard, I just take a hammer and whack them on the back. And that kind of then splinters them into lots of different shaped pieces. And then I've kind of then just done normal Tetris thing to kind of build that up. Now, initially, I started off by filling the cracks with sculptor mold. and then when that was dry, painting over them. I decided to do that because it felt like the gaps were a bit too conspicuous, and what I didn't want to have to do was to fill every single gap with bushes. I wanted to kind of have that choice as to which I used bushes on and which I didn't. So I started out with this approach. Didn't like how that looked, so I've now been kind of taking that sculpt mold back a little bit. So here you can just kind of see where I've been doing that. And then the technique I'm now using, which I'm a lot happier with, is over here on the right-hand side. So this is something I saw on Pride Parkway. What you do is you get some tiling grout, some plaster of Paris, a little bit of PVA, and then just a little bit of water just to turn that into a sticky paste. And then with just a bit of offcut of wood, just kind of go into all the cracks and just kind of smear all that round, leaving a very rough texture, so it looks a lot more like rock. So now that's ready for me to still go back over the top with some washes and some other kind of highlights on the rocks. The rocks themselves were all painted using the same technique as the viaduct. So start off with a base colour. Either, in this case, I alternated between that sand colour I used on the viaduct and the earth brown, and then just go over the top with successive washes until you get this effect. As I say, this isn't the final state. They're going to need a little bit of work, but you'll see that shortly. So next things are going to be, I'm going to go over and paint the landscape as it is, just so I can get a sense of where the riverbed is, where the land is. I'm going to finish going into the gaps on the rest of that rock face. And I also need to kind of work on the bits of sculpt mold down the back there. You can see isn't quite finished. You'll also notice that track is starting to be laid. So that's some track, and then that's the southern main line that's going to run off around there. So I'll keep laying that as I go as well. But that's not going to be the focus of this video. I'll do something separate from that. Okay, right, onwards. As you can see, we've made some more progress. So let me talk you through. So if we start with the rocks, I've been over these with a couple of washes. So that's kind of really tied in where that grout was before. So the idea is going into the cracks with the darker washes, and then I still need to then go and do some highlights with some dry brushing, probably a kind of a light grey kind of colour, just to kind of lift those a little bit. But they are starting to take shape, which is good. Landscape, I've just painted brown, and the river for the moment, I've just painted grey so we can see where that goes. The river, I've also given a coat of PVA, which is why it's a bit shiny at the moment. I've never used resin before, and I'm a little bit kind of terrified about it going everywhere. I can just remember that scene from the Model Railway Challenge where someone was pouring resin at the top, and then the second later the camera cuts to resin pouring out through the boards onto the floor. So I'm kind of really paranoid about that happening. So I'm just going to seal that with a couple of layers. I'm going to go over that again with some varnish, just make sure that bottom layer is really kind of sealed. Next step, I'm going to start adding some rocks into the landscape and getting them in place. So we're going to do some rock fall at the bottom of the cliff, just where kind of bits of rock have fallen down. And then in the river, we're going to have our riffles, which are going to be kind of more rocky areas where the water's flowing faster through them. And then there'll be a graduation of the kind of the size of the rocks. Now, slower water can only hold smaller particles. So as we kind of see on this side, we have the slowest water through to the fastest in the Thalweg, and then kind of up again into faster water. So our big rocks will be in the faster flowing areas. And our kind of softer sediments are going to be in the slower areas. This area on the kind of the inside of the bend is known as the cow belly, because I believe that the cow, the hair on a cow's belly is the kind of the softest, and this is the slowest part of the river, and therefore this is where the softest sediments sit. So I'm going to use some sand and things like that, just to kind of create a real kind of soft, silty kind of bank down this side.
And then I don't know if it comes across on the camera, but you kind of have got this profile talked about, which is kind of this convex side of the river down into the Thalweg, and then the kind of the concave bank on the other side. So that kind of profile has been kept quite nicely. And then down this end, again, there'll be some kind of rocks. We're kind of heading from a glide into some riffles again down here. So again, there'll be some kind of stone. So I've got a few bits of kind of plaster rock painted up. So I'm just going to get those put in place and just kind of move them around and until I get to something that I'm happy with. And so I'll come back when I've done that. I've got further on again, and I thought it'd be good to show you just exactly where I've got up to. So the main thing to notice is that there are now lots of rocks and stones and gravel and things all over the place. So remember, a lot of this is going to be underwater, so it looks quite, I don't know what the word is, look quite rocky and kind of coarse at the moment. So this is our riffle, so this is where our water is going to be fast flowing and shallowest. Again, down through our glide into our pool, which is the deepest and slowest moving area, and then just getting again into an area at the beginning of a riffle there where you're going to have some faster moving water. Much more compressed, I think, than it would be in reality, but we're pretty much used to that as railway modelers. Just to talk you through then the kind of the rocks and the grading. So we start out here on our sculptor mold, down over. This is some War World Scenics mud effect. Then down into, this is just sand. And then we've got a bit of sand and tile grout. And then some ballast. Then this is aquarium gravel. It's actually blue and green aquarium gravel, so it's been painted. And then these are kind of small stones here, with the idea being that the bigger rocks are closest to the faster flowing water, and the kind of the finest material is at the slowest point. So this is our kind of softest silts round here in our cow belly. And then along the way, we've just got some kind of bigger rocks. This is going to be kind of cascades. So there's kind of a main channel through here, but then there are a few rocks which will get some water kind of flowing on and around to create some white water. I've added some more rocks there. They need a little bit more highlighting. The rocks around here are in places wet because I've started to go over with some soil from the garden just to add some texture onto the kind of the areas where that would fall. But you can see that I've been over and with just lightly dry brushed some kind of very light grey and then just some off-white just to kind of really accentuate the kind of highlights. And again, we've got some kind of darker washes in all the cracks just to give that sense of shadow. This is where our waterfall is going to be. So I'll be covering that separately. I've also made some progress around here. I've got a fence in. That's just an old kind of kitmaster fence just to give it a little bit more variety for the different types of fencing on the layout. Everything's been painted. So usually painted dark grey and then over the top with different colours of wash. And then here you can see the glue drying where I'm starting to go over with soil, and I'm going to go over the soil with the whole of the kind of the landscape. So next job is going to be, I'm going to add another layer of sealant over the top of the river area just to be sure that that's kind of ready for resin when we eventually get to that point. And then more dirt, effectively cover everything in dirt. And then I'm going to start static grassing some of the areas. So for example, this bank here is a prime candidate for some static grass. The steeper areas over here, I will think about things like my Koya bushes and things like that, kind of real kind of wild landscape, because obviously no one's going to be kind of climbing up that bank for any reason. And then you can see down here, we've got this kind of muddy path running alongside the river as if that's the place that kind of people do kind of walk when it's a bit drier. So yeah, taking shape, still work to do. So I'll come back when we've made a bit more progress. It was slightly more work than I thought it was going to be. I said I was just going to cover this in some grass and some bushes, and that actually took loads of time. So there's quite a lot to actually talk through here. Before I do, just to explain for those of you who are not regular watchers of the channel, my philosophy is to kind of get to about 80% happy with an area on the layout, and then move on to somewhere else, with the idea being that you can then come back to that area when you've improved as a modeler and when you've had a chance to kind of live with what you've done for a little bit and see if there's any way of improving it. So this is kind of my 80%, minus obviously the water that still needs to go in. So I'm going to move on from here now, but let me just talk you through a few things that you may have spotted have appeared. So on top of my dirt, I've just gone over everything with static grass. My usual technique that, which I'm not going to go into any detail. I don't do anything different to any other video I've seen out there, so I won't dwell on that. And then we've got a mixture of kind of woodland scenic bushes, some of the coir bushes that I've showed how I make before. What else have we got in here? A few twigs to represent kind of logs and things that have kind of got trapped in some of the water. You'll also see some tree roots poking out through the bank. These are just bits of grass that are growing places that shouldn't be. Pull them out, cut the grass off the top, wash the roots off, zap them in the microwave for a bit, and then kind of cut the bits out that you want that then kind of make them look like root systems. There are a couple of places where I need to add a few bushes to make it look like those are then the roots kind of coming down. Trees, there are 3 different types of tree on here. These ones are my seafoam trees, so exactly the same technique I used in the previous video. As I said in that video, just kind of go with different kinds of scatters and kind of experiment with it, and you'll get kind of different effects. With some of the trees, I've kind of cut bits of seafoam off and super glued them on to kind of, because seafoam is a very distinctive shape, so to get kind of more spread out tree effect, I've done that with some of them. There is a Jarvis tree in there, but that's had a bit of a coating of scatter just to improve the look of that. And this one down the front here is made from a hydrangea, which I will show how you do in a future Track Talk episode, because I hadn't even thought about that until someone came into the club with a bag full of dried hydrangea flower heads. So I'll come back to that another time. Otherwise, it's really the kind of usual combination of kind of static grass and kind of various scatters, just to kind of make things look suitably wild in places. And as I say, I think there are still a few kind of bushes and things that need to go on here. But otherwise, I think I'm kind of 80% happy. So I'm going to kind of move on and then kind of, I'm sure I'll keep kind of tinkering with this over the course of time. So that's where we've got to. I've been working on this for so long, it's kind of hard to remember what it was like before I started. But when I go back and kind of watch the video of the bare baseboards, that kind of makes me feel really happy about where we've got to. This was another area on the layout that I was kind of dreading a little bit. And I think I'm still dreading the water bit. But I say I'm not in any hurry to do that. I'll make sure I'm absolutely happy with everything before I then come back and have a go at that. But hopefully if I get down there, you can still see that kind of profile of the river is there. And hopefully when there's water in there, that's going to look even better.
I hope you enjoyed watching that. It was a lot of fun building that part of the layout, I have to say. The next part's slightly terrifying because that's going to involve water and resin and all these kind of things that I've never used before. So that's going to need a lot of research. I've already started doing some. Been watching quite a few videos. People like Luke Towan. I know Piccadilly Model Railway. There's been some kind of water features been added recently, so I've been taking a look at those. And lots of other places as well. So I'm going to keep doing that until I feel really comfortable and kind of confident in starting to kind of take that next step. But that will all be in the next video. I'm sure to the expert geographers there are a few things that aren't quite right, but hopefully we can cover some of those up with the water. So I'll just leave you now with a couple of running shots of kind of trains running along the heritage line next to this scene, just so you can kind of see how that scene is now starting to come together a little bit. But I hope you enjoyed. There'll be a subscribe button in a second, so if you're not subscribed, please consider doing so. And I'll be back with another video very soon, so I shall catch you all soon. Bye bye.